Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce.
It's only 2 weeks since we've talked about Russia and Ukraine, and here we have the situation with the troops in the Donbass, in the separatist area, and I was seeing reports this morning about Soviet troops in Belarus on the border of Ukraine as well. Somebody asked me this week, is this World War III? How far do you think this is going to escalate?
Well, I think it's going to escalate further. One thing we do know that there has been a disconnect between what Mr. Putin has been saying about what Russia is going to do, what it's actually done. But Mr. Putin has sort of taken slimy slices out of Ukraine starting in 2014. He now has control and troops have moved in to Donetsk and Luhansk. But of course those armed separatist groups which are backed by Moscow do not control the whole of the Donbass.
Right.
So it's very difficult to see how this is not going to be a confrontation in eastern Ukraine. But all the indications are that Mr. Putin hasn't mobilized this massive force simply to, if you like, to tear off a segment of eastern Ukraine. It looks like he's going for Kiev and to overthrow the government.
If you're right then, I mean, how does this then play out? How does Ukraine respond? How do Western allies, NATO allies respond? Does this become a small battleground or does it become a big war?
Well, we don't know, Bruce, to be absolutely candid and honest, but I think we can speculate a bit. We know, for example, that the United States and the EU have taken a number of sanctions out against the regime and particularly its oligarchs. And the threat from the Biden administration is that Russia will be effectively cut off from the international financial system. This is not just a problem for Ukraine. This is a problem for every country in the world, including New Zealand. If you've got one of the five members of the Security Council that's effectively one of the crucial dimensions of being a UN member is non-interference in domestic affairs, territorial integrity, and rights as a sovereign state. So these are being, blatantly disregarded by one of the most powerful countries in the world in terms of its military power anyway. And this is something which New Zealand, I heard the Foreign Minister speak about this today, is gravely concerned about. But I think the middle powers and the smaller powers must not just leave this to the EU and the United States. They must make their views clear. Mr. Putin must know that the rest of the world opposes what he does. Right.
So let me ask you about that and New Zealand's response, because I think a lot of people wouldn't realise that New Zealand can't make an independent response from what the UN approves. Is that correct?
Yes, we don't have a unilateral sanctions mechanism which some states have. We prefer to operate because this country puts so much store on an international rules-based system where actions are authorised by international institutions because we believe in multilateralism, international cooperation. We have ruled out the option of applying sanctions unilaterally, as some states have. I believe Australia has. But we should be, I think, moving heaven and earth to not only express saying to Mr. Putin, this will not be allowed to stand. And secondly, taking concrete steps to ensure it's not allowed to stand. This is a tragedy, absolute tragedy. In the 21st century, we have the same sort of land grabbing that we saw in the 1930s under the Hitler regime. If you think about, the Anschluss and Sudetenland, the other tragedy here is that the UN Security Council is not fit for purpose. It has to be reformed. At the moment, why is this evasion occurring? Because there's no international mechanism to prevent it.
So why, if there's no international mechanism, to stop that happening, why do we continue to only operate with UN-approved sanctions? Why do you think, you're saying you still think that's the better way?
I think I'm not advocating getting rid of the UN. I do think we need to make it more functional, and we only do that through speaking out within the UN framework of how we can improve it. And so I think let's be quite clear. Great powers do not run the world. Some of them think they can, but they cannot. But why? Because the problems facing states are too big for them, even superpowers. And we're talking about problems like transnational terrorism, climate change, COVID-19. None of these problems can be solved by great powers. So we need international cooperation. So if we didn't have the UN, we'd probably have to reinvent it, given all these problems. But we do need to make it work better. And I think New Zealand needs to reinforce its long-term demand that the veto powers of the Permanent Five have to be revisited again. We have to come up with an effective way of stopping gangster politics. We can't have people just tearing strips off other neighbours' territory given a particular interpretation of history, which has no basis in facts. This is a serious situation, and we have a big stake. As a small but global player, we make our living by trading around the world. We have a big stake in making sure the rules-based order survives. The alternative is an international free-for-all where might is right, and I think many of us feel very uncomfortable about that.
Am I right in thinking that in terms of Europe and conflict, we haven't had this sort of land grab since World War II? Is that what you were saying?
Well, 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, was the first time in the post-45 period that one state used force to change the borders of another state, right, and gained in the process.
So we're going into uncharted territory since World War II.
Yeah.
We haven't had a war in Europe since then.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a realistic possibility?
It could become a possibility because many countries in Eastern Europe see Ukraine as a stalking horse. Remember, Mr. Putin's demands are not confined to Ukraine. He said that Ukraine must never be allowed to join NATO, but he also said that all countries in Eastern Europe which have joined NATO in the post-Cold War period must effectively disestablish the military infrastructure they have developed as a result. In a sense, he's saying they must leave NATO. Again, what he's trying to do here is re-establish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. It's sort of, like the Beatles' old song, Back to the USSR. He clearly believes that the disintegration of the Soviet Union, he disagreed with, Mr. Putin's a conservative, he disagreed with the ideology, but, he certainly wants a conservative version of the Soviet Union or its sphere of influence. He wants a Russian, I think the best way of putting it, he wants a greater Russia. And he wants a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe.
So what's the lesson that the US and the UK take from history when they apply it to this situation? If Russia invades Ukraine, do you have to respond with military force to stop that at that point? Or do you say, okay, you can have Ukraine?
No, you do not say to Mr. Putin, we're going to reward you for taking illegally land from your neighbour by allowing you to have that as a buffer state. Because from their point of view, his ambitions, he would see that as weakness.
Sure. But do you stop that by sanctions and not trading, or do you have to do something firmer?
There's no instant solution, but a comprehensive package of sanctions, and also a clear warning, which the Americans have given, that should Russian forces seek to expand out of Ukraine, should they invade all of it, will be met with resistance because the surrounding countries are NATO members. But the extraordinary thing about this crisis, Bruce, and something which makes it so difficult to analyse, is that Mr. Putin has always said that he wanted a solution in which Ukraine couldn't be a member of NATO. But every step he's taken since 2014 has entrenched NATO in the region and also made more and more Ukrainians, I'm talking about the 45 million plus that do not want to be part of Russia, has made them look ever more to NATO for protection. So, it seems to me that his policy of using force is actually completely counterproductive and out of sync with his stated political agenda.
So if you had to take a bet on it, are we going to see US troops in Ukraine fighting Russians?
No, I don't think we're going to see US troops in Ukraine fighting Russians. Neither side, both Russia and the United States, are mindful of their nuclear powers. But what I think we could see is Russia moving into Ukraine, not making any attempts to move beyond Ukraine, and trying to consolidate its power. And we could see a very violent and tragic conflict in the heart of Europe, which causes horrendous damage, both economically and to people, and which Russia pays a terrible price. Taking over a country, as the Americans discovered in Iraq, is not the trick. The trick is to displace a government and then produce a political environment which is your preferred outcome. What's Mr. Putin's preferred outcome? It's a friendly government in Kiev or running Ukraine, which is pro-Russian and immediately has the support of the people there. That's not possible. There's 45 million Ukrainians and they seem absolutely determined to resist Russia. So I think he's walking into a hornet's nest. Many Russian, it's not just, if you listen to the criticisms coming from senior Russian military officials, some of them are deeply concerned about the situation. As one said, this invasion will not be a Tea Party, and another one said it will be catastrophic for Russia. So what we may be looking at is a drawn-out conflict which will have terrible consequences in people terms, the loss of life, and it will drain the resources of both Ukraine and Russia. And I think you'll have a lot of outside powers, not least in Eastern Europe, supporting Ukraine because they believe their fate as democracies are linked to the survival of Ukraine as a democracy. And the Ukrainians may lose power, they may get forced into guerrilla operations, but that will not be the end of it.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.